Hello. I'd like you to meet an old friend of mine. Well, old as in it's a tube television manufactured in February 1997. It is legally old enough to drink. I bought this secondhand at a garage sale maybe 6 or 7 years ago. As silly as it would seem to some, I know many will understand why I went through the trouble of lugging home this piece of outdated equipment. I wanted to play my old video games and watch analog content without the problems associated with modern displays. An old CRT displays old media the way it had been intended. You may notice my old friend is battered and a little dusty. It's probably because I never use it. I only recently rescued it from storage in the garage since moving, having finally cleared out what little space I have for it. But sadly, it may soon be once again banished to my car's drafty home. Here's the thing. I think I'm maybe ready to finally bid adieu to analog video. Now let me save some of you a little time. I'm not going to go into the technicals of display resolutions, refresh rates, or anything of the nuts and bolts that the more hardcore purists will cite as to why my opinion on this matter is completely bonkers. I'm not doing screenshot comparisons, measuring response times, or anything like that. Because let's be honest, if you stay awake at night trying to get the absolute best results for last century's games, hardware, and media, a cathode ray tube will win hands down. However, I also need to be realistic with myself. I was hooking up my equipment using standard composite cables, sometimes even the dreaded RF for these old farts. I was never trying to squeeze the best color and clarity out of every last pixel on the screen. And this Panasonic TV here never dazzled any eyes. It simply looked how I remembered playing back in the 80s and 90s. This was essentially all I needed. As I've gotten older, I began to realize that space is often a bit too limited to dedicate a not insignificant portion of it just for the sole purpose of hooking up Ataris and Sega stations. I spent many a restless evening trying to figure out a way to get that CRT experience on the flat screen with the minimal amount of concessions. While I appreciate that I am obsessive just enough to stress about obtaining a certain authentic look to my games, but not quite to the point where I'm spending several $100s on GameCube component cables, I still find myself jealous. Jealous of those people who could just throw some cheap AV cables into their LCD, thumbing their noses at proper aspect ratios, and still have a grand old time playing their game. Yeah! That's not to say they weren't answers to my search for interlaced gaming in a progressive scan world. The Framemeister XRGB Mini was one such product, and from what I've seen, the results were gorgeous. And all without much of that nasty input lag your friends warned you about. But priced at around $500, it was a bit too steep for anyone except the most hardcore retro gamer. And worse still, as they were no longer in production, you had to deal with the second-hand market to obtain one, with prices climbing higher in line with the demand. Of course, there were cheap converters on eBay and Amazon, but those did little to make the old signal palatable on the new TVs. They were often nothing more than adapters, and as were often the case with these cheap devices, you'd hit a button on your controller and get an answer back from your TV in approximately 3 business days. So goodbye desk space, welcome back bulky CRT. How did we ever have room for literally anything else in our homes before the advent of wall-mounted TVs, I'd wonder to myself. But it would seem that the retro gaming bug would eventually bite just the right amount of people over the intervening years. And as such, better solutions have emerged that are friendly not only to those who aren't quite as tech-savvy, but also those who can't justify a large credit card bill for upscalers. One such supplier is RetroTink, with their assortment of line doublers and special cables that have made the process of hooking up old hardware to new TVs a lot less nauseating. And like the Framemeister, it promises little to no additional lag. I'm not getting paid to say this, by the way, but I have had great results with my RetroTink 2X Pro device here. It's not the most high-end answer for the discerning eye, but I'm quite pleased. I'll go out on a limb and say that for most people, this will be all they need. If you got some later consoles that can use component or SCART cables and you don't mind spending a little more money and time configuring options, the open source scan converter is not a bad investment. I do not have first-hand experience with this device, but reviews appear to be positive. And don't tell anybody, but I've kind of been warming up to foregoing original hardware, opting instead to game on emulator devices that have some nice CRT filters to highlight the beauty of resolution limitations. But that's a topic for another video. But what about old analog media like videotapes or laserdiscs? Turns out, my inexpensive 4K display does a better than okay job handling the composite input. Obviously, it'll look better on a CRT, but we're not screening art films for the Academy for Award considerations over here. We're waxing nostalgic with old videotapes, learning tongue twisters with Bill Murray, and working out with Jane Fonda. The bottom line here is that I think it's finally safe for me to move on and put the tube TVs back in storage. I don't plan on getting rid of them completely, but I no longer need to depend on them to satisfy my basic minimum requirements for retro gaming and watching the occasional video rental I forgot to return decades ago. I'm not gonna lie, it's a little liberating. That said, I still have room in my heart for one of those 1970s portables with telescopic rabbit ears, or even one of those humongous console TVs with the screw-in terminals, clicky dials, and a dusty old wood-grain VCS semi-permanently attached to it. I'll just make some more room in the garage if I ever happen upon one. When it comes to retro gaming, are you a strict CRT purist? Or have you been okay with modern displays? Let me know in the comments. Or in the immortal words of the New York metropolitan area's favorite 1980s independent television network senior vice president, Richard N. Hughes,
what's your opinion? We'd like to know.